In this episode of post-production, audio post-production, we are going to examine what are the different stages of post-production, what are the technicalities of post-production, and how the technical decisions also affect the aesthetic decisions. Now, in order to understand the post-production, we must understand that it is a very complicated process and it can involve a lot of stages. I will give you the example of mostly a film post-production because it entails the maximum amount of complexity and largest number of people to be coordinating the entire thing in order to get the final mix, in order to get the final soundtrack of a film. Now, actually the sound designing or the post-production of a film begins much earlier than the film itself. It begins when the idea of the film is first discussed. In fact, the sound designer or the main person who is responsible for the entire sound of the film, sometimes also known as the sound editor, he should collaborate and coordinate with the directorial department from the very first, when the first idea gets developed and when it gets for the first time discussed. There may be many issues which might come up during this stage. For example, there might be some characters, some spaces, even some props and jewelries which can, generate some fascinating sound ideas which can be incorporated inside the script itself during the shooting. In order to understand post-production, we must first divide it up into certain processes which will be followed very strictly, and it has to be managed in a very efficient manner in order to kind of get the sound that we are trying to get. It begins with the editing, where the picture cut is decided upon, and after the final picture is edited or locked, we go on to the next stage. The video gets transferred to the audio studio, and all the necessary tracks which were used during the editing itself, in all probability the pilot tracks, they will also go to the audio studio. Now it is the duty, the first step in the post-production, it is the duty of the location sound engineer and editor to sort through all the takes. Sometimes it might be that there are other takes which were taken during the shooting. So it will be the job of the production sound editor to get all these takes together and to perform the cuts so that all the dialogues which were used during the shooting are properly put together with the picture. Another job that he does is a very important thing. It's called dialogue cleaning, and basically cleaning up the session so that we can use it. Now, it is important to remember that during a production stage or during the shooting stage, it is not possible to get all the sounds together, like the ambient sounds, the Foley sound and the dialogue sound. It will become technically impossible to get all the sounds perfectly. Therefore, in order to make the process much more efficient, only gathering the dialogue is what is done during the shooting process. So getting a clean dialogue is of utmost importance, and if there is any noise which is creeping in, we should take another take, or we should also dub those dialogues in a place where there is a little bit of silence, and that seeing the video itself, seeing the take itself, the actors can dub their lines. Therefore, the additional, this person or the location sound recordist, the location sound engineer, he will be having a reserve of all these takes, and he will put in all the takes which are necessary, and also will synchronize all the dialogues with the proper lip synchronization. It is his job also to determine which are the places which might be needing the dub, which might be needed to be patched later on, so that we kind of go to the next step, which is the ADR, or automated dialogue replacement. In this stage, all the dialogues of the film which are necessary to be dubbed, and in some cases in films where the dialogue needs to be dubbed anyway, there was no dialogue recording which happened during the take, all these dialogues needs to be recorded during the ADR stage and needs to be matched with the location sound if there is this need. And in the next stage, the sound designer himself, or with the help of a team, will sit down together designing all the other ambient sounds and the other special effects sounds, like for example car passing or maybe the shotgun, the sound of a bullet whizzing past, or you know, the specialized sound, like the swish of a whip. All these sounds needs to be properly placed, and also a schedule needs to be generated whereby all the different ambiences which will be required for the sound designer to be put in are scheduled. So all these things are done in, it can be done in one post-production studio or in different post-production studios. Like for example, the next step is the Foley recording, which is a very important step because it kind of creates all the synchronized sound effects that we see on the screen. And of course, after the cut is locked, the film also goes to the music composer, who along with his team will identify all the portions where music needs to be put. This music can be either sourced from previously recorded material or copyrighted material, or they might be generated during the process, they might be recorded, they might be composed also. For this, the music composer of the film is responsible. And after all these things are collected in individual studios or maybe sharing the same studios, the different sessions are put together in something in the process called the re-recording process or the mixing process, where all the individual dialogues, the Foley, the ambience and the other effects, the music are compiled together and mixed down to a format which will be later on slapped with the picture to get the final print. During the shooting, there will be a lot of work to be done. The actors, the other department, the technical department, the sound department, the camera department, the props department, the costume department. In all these confusion and coordination, it sometimes becomes impossible to gather the sound that is required for the post-production. And when I say gather the sound, I actually mean not only just gather the dialogues, but also the other sounds, including the footsteps of the characters, the body clothing, the body sounds, the clothing sounds, and other sounds, including the ambient sounds of the place and some special effects. But as we know that during shooting it becomes very difficult to gather all these sounds, and therefore only dialogue is concentrated upon. Well, there are exceptions, like for example the film King Kong, which was recently also got the Oscar for best sound designing. This film was actually shot twice. Once the camera was rolling, and for the second take the sound was rolling. So all the individual takes were taken twice. If the first one to capture the video, the second one is to capture the sound. Constrictions of the production or the budget of the production or the time constraint will not allow to be so elaborate. Therefore, what is being tried to capture during the shooting is just the pilot track, and in fact this pilot track plays a very important role for the editor to decide the cuts, and later on for the ADR process or the dubbing process to be done, because this track will give the reference for the actors, that how they behaved or how they dubbed or how they acted during the shooting, and will help them to recreate the dubs in a much more efficient manner. I must say that before any sound design starts, there is this process which is very important. This process is called spotting. Now, spotting is basically looking at the picture without the sound and identifying all the places where all the different sounds are to be put. Now, this spotting process has to be very thorough, and a spotting list needs to be generated by all the different individual departments of the post-production. The first one is done by the production sound guy. He will kind of look at the entire sound. He will try to replace all the dialogues properly, and will see that which portion needs to be dubbed. So he will generate a list of all the portions that needs to be dubbed along with a reference of a time code. Now, it is extremely important to remember to put in the time code superimposed on the work print itself, because that will give a time reference for all the different departments of the sound post production. So the location sound guy will determine, he might also, you know, if there might be two kinds of noises which he might encounter during the post production cleanup. One is a constant noise of the set, maybe some AC running or some humming of some traffic or some other sounds or constant sound. But the other kind of noise which are, you know, very accidental in nature or very sharp in their character. Like for example, imagine someone delivering a dialogue and some crow in the background which is cawing. There might be, you know, a thunderstruck, or there might be some wind noise which might. So all these portions where the dubbing is necessary will have to be pointed out by the location sound engineer guy. Now in the ADR process, also the dubbing, before the dubbing starts, before the process of ADR starts, the dubbing engineer must also see the film in its entirety, and along with the production department and the direction department, they must also generate a proper list which gives an indication of where and which dialogues needs to be recorded, so that this list can be given back to the production department so that the actors can be coordinated when to come to the studio and dub. The Foley engineer, it's also his duty to kind of sit with the film before he starts his job and do a very thorough spotting of the entire Foley sound that will be required. He will not only write down all the sounds that needs to be recorded, but also some special props that needs to be acquired. Now these special props might have been used during the shooting itself, in which case it's the duty of the sound studio to be coordinating with the production department to gather all those things, or if not possible, they might also buy some of these things. For example, the list might include different kinds of shoes which are worn by different characters. For example, rubber sandals, men's shoes, men's sandals, men's slippers. All this needs to be properly listed down, so that even if the Foley studio has all these equipments, they need to be collected and put in one place for the Foley artist to be using them. Now the music department along with the music composer will also have to sit in coordination with the directorial department and find out all the different places where music needs to be put. Now there can be several types of music in a post-production. It can be a background music, it can be a song, or it can be some music which is playing incidentally. For example, some song playing from a radio or from television. Now all these list needs to be generated. Which are the songs which are already previously recorded but which will be required in the final post-production? What are the places where background needs to be recorded, background music? What are the instruments that are going to be used? What are the compositions that are going to be used? All these things needs to be put down in the spotting list by the music department. And after all the spotting is done, all the individual department can go on about their work, either together in sharing the same studio or using different studios. But it must be remembered that all the post-production schedule needs to be maintained very correctly, and there has to be certain technical parameters which needs to be properly followed by all the studios, because there will be session interchanges. Now imagine one of the studios recorded the dialogue in 44.1 kilohertz, but the Foley was recorded in 48 kilohertz. In that case, confusions might arise. Therefore, it is the duty of the main sound editor or the sound designer to specify the format. In fact, the formats are already specified because all the studios nowadays use 24-bit bit depth and 48 kilohertz sampling rate. So all the post-production can either start simultaneously or can start parallelly in different studios. Aim of the sound engineer to get the best possible dialogue as will be legible and as might be usable in the post-production. But due to different kind of noises, it is very difficult to get them. Sometimes there might be constant noises which might be cut down using different noise reduction plugins. But the problem comes when there is sporadic noise. For example, when there is a car horn, or when there is a sudden wind blast, or when there is some kind of noise which is overlapping with the dialogues. In that case, the portion needs to be marked during the spotting session and needs to be transferred to the ADR session. During the ADR of a film where the location sound as well as the ADR session dialogues will be used together, to use the same kind of microphone configuration that was used during the recording. That will help in, you know, reducing the time to adjust and match the both the dialogues. So we will get the same tonality of the dialogue, and it will take much lesser time to match the original dialogues with the freshly recorded dialogues. And in those portions, it is also important to remember during the shooting, the different ambiences that were recorded will be used to patch up those portions. In this stage, the characters come one by one and do their lines during the whole process of the film. So, say for example, there are 5 reels in a film, and the first character, say character A, has got 2 minutes in reel 1, 4 minutes in reel 2, 23 minutes in reel 3, 5 minutes in reel 2, and certain other time in reel 5, the last reel. So all this portion needs to be marked properly so that he can go one by one to all the scenes and go on dubbing. It will be additional job of the dubbing engineer to ensure that the recordings sound as like one recording, so that there is a continuity in the recording. It might be that the same character might be recording in 2 days or 3 days, which might kind of affect his voice quality. So it is the duty of the sound engineer who is dubbing the film to be maintaining the qualitative character of the voice. It is also important to maintain the distance or the perspective, and you know, in cases where there is a long shot, to place the microphone a little further away, but enough not to get the room tone, of course. But then these minute details needs to be checked and while recording during the dubbing session. Also, the level needs to be maintained, and we must understand that during this process of dubbing, the main information of sound is getting recorded. So it is also the job of the dubbing engineer to be maintaining all these things, and finally to compile the dubbing session. There might be 20 characters. In that case, there will be 20 different tracks recording the characters separately in different tracks. There might be 5 layers of crowd. So there will be 25 tracks which will have to be properly recorded, cleaned up, and made ready for the final mix. It must be remembered that the ADR stage happens pretty early in the film sound post-production. This happens sadly because in most of the cases we find that the pilot sound which was recorded during the shooting is not legible or is not clear enough for the editor to understand the cuts. Therefore, in this case, what will happen after the dubbing is done, the entire dubbing session is mixed down and sent to the editing studio so that the editor can sit again with the session and fine cut or do the final cut of the film. We must remember, after the final cut, the film will again go back to the ADR studio so that the original session can be rematched or recut or re-edited with the final picture track. And henceforward, we will go to the next part, which is the Foley recording. As we all know, Foley is the name of a person, Jack Donovan Foley, who was operating in Hollywood and had this idea that if we perform an action, record the sound and put that sound over the pictorial action, it increases the believability of the shot. So in this stage, we are basically making a ground level connection of the film with reality. How a character will walk, how will he sit, how will his feet touch the ground and make a sound. All these things are determined. If even the character of the space, like if the floor is a wooden floor or it's a concrete floor, if it's an unused floor and if there is, you know, dirt on the floor, then it will create its own effect. So we are basically at this stage bringing the film and connecting the film with reality and making it much more believable. It must also be remembered that Foley sessions are not our ears are not trained to identify Foley sessions as such. So Foley sessions are normally heard along with ambient sessions or the environmental sound, and they actually, in our mind, they form a part of the environmental sound. So in most of the cases, the Foley sound will be acting at a very psychological level in bringing a character to reality. Like we can take an example of a character in a film who is an imaginary character, or say for example a ghost. we can determine during this stage, during the Foley recording stage, that we will do his footsteps very lightly, very softly, and we will also do his clothing sounds very softly. Therefore, not being very outward or not being very descriptive, we can subtly change the character, and for all the other characters the Foley sound might be normal. Therefore, when we are seeing the whole film in perspective, it will only be indicative at a very subconscious level that this character is somewhat lighter than the other characters, and therefore we can understand that Foley recording or implementing the Foley sound can also give a certain kind of characterization, special characterization to a space or to a character. The next stage is the sound effects design. Here the spaces are properly established, all the ambiances are put, all the all the ambiances are, all the special effects sounds are put. You know, some sounds which we normally don't hear may be designed during this process. Say for example, the sound of a bullet whizzing past, the sound of a whip, you know, going through the air. All these sounds are created, either they are recorded or they may be taken up from a bank of recording or a library to be put through the entire film, so that, you know, the door of a car, the banging on the door by a neighbor, you know, all these sounds needs to be put during this stage, and it actually is the stage which will determine the final character of a film. So the sound designer will have a greater control over this session than the other sessions, because this is where he can very subliminally change the character of a film. If we take the example of a very classic film, Robert Bressot's The Man Escaped, we will see, you know, the Nazi regime, their torture and the claustrophobia generated by them inside a prison is being brought about by the sound narrative. You know, the hard footsteps of the guard reverberating on the prison cells, the, you know, the sound of the key opening and closing prison bars, the sound of the shouts of the German soldiers, the sound of the execution of the, you know, of the other soldiers by German soldiers, which we never see on the screen, but all these sounds come and affect the entire narrative of the film.
Il me fallait attendre, j'approchais du but, la moindre erreur pouvait m'être fatale.
It kind of creates the situation of horror, the, you know, the extreme fear that all the inmates are living in. And in fact, in a very brilliant stroke of sound design, we see by the end of the film, when the prisoner starts escaping, that there is actually a train line by the side of the prison, and very artfully these prisoners use the sound of passing trains to mask their footsteps in order to escape.
Les graviers crissaient sous nos pas, nous dûmes nous arrêter.
So we will see that during the process of sound designing and putting all the ambiances, this process is sometimes also known as track laying. So during this track laying process, the entire milieu of the film is established. Now the music recording is also a very important part, which should ideally start off at an earlier stage, during the ADR stage or maybe during the Foley stage. Now the main work for the music department is to collect all the copyrighted materials, to record all the portions of background music that needs to be recorded, which these recordings are normally a mixture of virtual instruments which can be generated inside a computer, and also real instruments which can be recorded inside a studio floor. You know, the VST technology or the plugin technology has improved so much that one can actually compose and output a whole symphony from a computer. Therefore, all the VST instruments and the plugins which the music composer will use, they will also generate very high quality effects. Therefore, the music department will gather all these sounds, will record all these sounds, and will also lay it with respect to the picture track, so that wherever music is needed, we get it in its proper form. If there is any music to be recorded for songs, that is also done during this stage. All the musical tracks are first recorded, and then the final the vocalist will come and dub their portions, and all the tracks are readied for the final mix. After all the departments has finished their process, like the ADR department has done their dubs, the Foley department has recorded all the synchronous sounds, and the track laying department has done the track laying, and also the music department has finished their job. All the separate projects are compiled together into something called the mixing session. Now, this mixing process is sometimes also known as the re-recording process, and normally for a proper budget film, there will be a different person who will come in during this stage to do the re-recording. Now, it's very important to remember that re-recording the word itself, because the re-recordist will actually be going through the entire track containing the dialogue, the Foley, the ambiences and the music, and will decide which are the options to be kept and which are the options to be, you know, switched off or taken out from the track. There might be portions where the final re-recordist will prefer the ambience track to be playing with the background track, but there will be portions where he might want to take it off in order to put our attention to certain things. So all the sessions are compiled together into this final mixing session.